Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jen Nelson. I am the VP of Marketing at Valora Technologies. So I'd like to welcome everyone this afternoon to session 5 of our Universal Auto-Classification Masterclass webinar series, where today we're going to be doing a deep dive into both the tactics and the benefits of automating the creation and management of rich metadata across the enterprise. We like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible, so there may be some polling questions throughout the webinar, so we invite you to participate in those, and that is going to help shape that conversation as we go out through the presentation for our presenters, which is awesome. As mentioned, this is session 5 of our ongoing webinar series. So this series lasts the entire year of 2019. And each one is a deep dive into different challenges that organizations face when, building out and strategizing for their IG strategy. So if you've missed the first 4 sessions, I invite you to visit our website and view those on demand. And I also invite you to register for the upcoming sessions in November and December. Let's next meet our speakers. So if you've attended a Valora webinar before, both these folks should be familiar to you. First, we've got Sandra Serkes, who is Valora Technologies CEO. And joining us today, we've got Julie Colgan, who's the Vice President of Solutions at Epiq. So thank you both for joining us today to share your knowledge and your expertise with us. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everybody. Some of you may remember a joint webinar series that Julie and I did last year called AutoClassification 101. If you have no idea what any of those words are, I strongly recommend you go listen to it. The whole series is available in pieces or as a full series on Valora's website. Julie and I had so much fun doing that that she was such a natural choice to rejoin us for our conversation, our deep dive on metadata. So thank you, Julie.
My pleasure.
And I think that we should just dive in. Most people know who we are and know that we have pretty strong backgrounds in both information governance and certainly around metadata. So I'm actually going to go ahead and launch one of the polls. Hopefully that's open. We're asking you guys to let us know what type of organization you represent, and we will share those results with you. This is something we usually do just to get a sense of who's out there. Most of you have responded. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so. All right, so we have a nice kind of healthy smattering today. I will share with you the poll results. Hopefully you guys can see that. So pretty good representation across the various areas, pretty evenly split between corporate, law firm, and government agency. So welcome everybody. I'm going to do one more poll just to tell us, okay, you told us what type of organization you're with. Tell us what your job function is. What group do you, let's say, most closely identify with? Okay, responses are coming in. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I will share those responses as well. This one, we got a definite lean towards RIM and information governance, not surprising. So again, welcome everybody. For those that do not have a RIM or IG background, don't worry, we're going to explain all the terms and things to you. And as Jen mentioned, if you have questions, just feel free to pop something in the little questions bar and we'll do our best to answer that. So without further ado, let's move forward. All right, so here's what we're going to cover today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we're going to go through these in detail, but basically a deep dive on metadata, understanding what it is, why it's so valuable, all the places you can go with rich metadata, including beyond information governance and RIM, and into some real-world examples of clients using rich metadata to kind of better their organizations. Okay, so Julie, maybe you could start us off. Why do we need metadata? What's the big thing?
Sure. So I'm actually super passionate about metadata because it is, at the end of the day, the thing that allows us to take actions with our eyes wide open. We're going to talk more about that later. But to do information management, we really, particularly in an electronic world, an increasingly digital world, we have to have it in order to make decisions on scale. Otherwise, we end up doing information management through arbitrary types of management approaches, and we'll talk about that too. So what metadata is, there's kind of three flavors of metadata in my mind. One is file level metadata, so that's the information that you get just within the file itself. So if you think about a Word document, you can go to properties and it will tell you the date it was created, when it was last updated, who the author was, based on the application or the system they're using. All of that kind of stuff is there. And that information is useful to know things about what that one item is. It doesn't, however, tell you anything about what's inside of that Word document. And so file or content level metadata is another area where we're seeing a lot of advances in the technology to allow us to generate metadata based on what's in the thing itself. So, for example, in a document, you might have a letter. It can understand that it's a letter because it has a certain format and certain content is in certain places. So it might identify the salutation, for example, be able to pull that name out and say this is the addressee or the subject of the document. And then the third one is context, and contextual metadata is derived metadata, just like content is, where it is generated based on where the item lives. So if you think about foldering, that was our attempt to create kind of contextual level metadata manually, but we can do that automatically now, even if the item isn't sitting within a folder. And we'll talk more about how we get there. But at the end of the day, like I said when I started, the point of metadata is to actually give us the ability to have our eyes wide open about what the item is, to make more informed decisions about how we handle it.
So one of the questions that I get asked is, why do we need this metadata now? Why is this such a hot topic now? And one of the big answers is because we are shifting kind of to a new content management paradigm, which is cloud-based and flattened. What I mean by flattened is not, a 6-level deep hierarchy folder taxonomy where you really have to either know where something lives by its folder location, or you have to be able to follow logically what somebody else set up. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. And so what's starting to happen is kind of moving away from that as the way to locate and retrieve content. Instead, we're using metadata tags, which are often called facets, F-A-C-E-T. So a facet would be like, what is the content about, or what business unit is involved, or what product names are mentioned. Each of those, which are like little data fields, are facets. They are metadata tags that are being used to manage, manipulate, recall, disposition the content. And so as we move to systems like SharePoint and other cloud-based mechanisms, we're going to be having a lot more flat structures that aren't relying on foldering, but are instead relying on metadata. If you've worked with the columns feature in SharePoint, you understand instinctively that that is metadata behind there populating those columns. So the more that we move to that kind of file structure, the more there's going to be an emphasis on rich metadata. All right. It turns out that we actually have a bunch of examples of rich metadata. We just didn't realize that that's what they were. But each one of these is a form of metadata creation and storage. Many of you are familiar with barcodes. That's the one on the left, where the information about the thing that has the barcode on it, whether that's a slip sheet in a document production or a bottle of shampoo, there's information contained in those bars that a barcode reader can then discern or display. So that's an example of metadata. Same with the QR code. And one of the fascinating things about the QR code is when you scan that QR code, let's say with your phone, you then go to a website that provides you that metadata. So not only do we have metadata in the first place, but it's been abstracted away from the actual thing that it represents. The barcode is a sticker on the bottle. The QR code takes you to a website somewhere else. And so we're kind of seeing this separation. And you guys, if you come to the webinar series a lot, you've heard me say a separation of data where it lives and data how it's used. And that's exactly what's happening in the case of the QR code. And then we have the driver's license, which is just a plethora of fabulous metadata about this fictitious person, Karen Sample. But for data privacy folks, you're probably going, oh my God, height, weight, home address, probably social security number or something similar. Driver's licenses for a long time have been little, essentially metadata cards that are representing the driver, the person. And so when we talk about enterprise content, we're effectively making a little card, a little driver's license for each document or each file that's being held inside the organization with a litany of metadata just like this that can be used for lots of different purposes. So this is just kind of a very, let's say, B2C type rich metadata. Julie, anything you want to add there?
No, but I love the analogy of we're creating little driver's licenses for our documents. That visual will remain with me forever. Thank you for that.
Excellent. Glad to populate your dreams and nightmares. There you go. Okay. All right. So now let's really understand what we mean when we say rich metadata for enterprise content. There's lots of different types of metadata that you can have. Julie, can you explain, you mentioned earlier file or system generated and rich metadata. What's the difference and how do you get one or the other?
Yeah, so I love the balloons. It's one of my favorite slides. So the yellow one there, it lists out creation date, signature date, effective date, last activity date, expiration date, destruction date. Some of those are file level and some of them are not. Creation date likely is, that is the date that's assigned by the application when you open the thing or create the thing. Effective date is a derived, that's a piece of rich metadata. So it's derived from some other place. So again, thinking content-based metadata, that would be an effective date. So if a system can look into a document and recognize it as a contract, for example, it can identify a date associated with phrase that it can then say, oh, this is talking about effective dates, and here's the date, and I can pull that date out and create that as a piece of metadata that is derived. So, all of these on here are interesting things to talk about. And I think there's one more. If you click at one more, there's also hidden metadata that presents an opportunity for us. So I'd love for you to share some stories about, what's really possible, how we can look at what's available just natively in the file and what's available to be derived, and how we can make good use of that.
Sure. I would kind of divide the rich metadata universe into kind of nice to know and directed. So nice to know metadata would be things like, what geographic territories are mentioned in here, which of our office locations, or we have a retailer that uses store location as a piece of metadata. Those are helpful, they're useful, they're really good when you're searching or trying to categorize information. But then you can also have what I would call directed rich metadata. So things like, is there personal data present, PII in the United States, personal data in Europe? Things like date of birth, names of your children, your home address. Those are things that are not exactly nice to have. They have more of a direction, which is to flag that piece of content as having sensitive data. That's useful in the first case, but it's extremely useful when you are responding to a DSAR or a data subject access request In other words, kind of like a personal FOIA request under GDPR or CCPA that says, I want to know everything you have on me, organization. So that's a very difficult task to undertake, usually within 30 days, when you unless you have metadata tags that say, oh, here's everything about, here's that little driver's license card and everything that references Sandy Serkes, who's making the access request. So you can have different types of metadata for different purposes. And one of the nice things is, as long as you're using auto-classification or an automated technique for determining rich metadata, you get some economy of scale and bang for the buck. You want to think about what are all the types of tags that would be helpful in different contexts. I do want to stress, I wouldn't just grab tags for tags' sake. You want your tags to have some sort of purpose for search and retrieval, for analysis, for responding to different things, because there is a trade-off in processing time. Obviously, the more you tag, the heavier the load on your processing system. So that's not something that we've covered before, but if your focus, as it is today, is on metadata particularly, one of the things that we recommend doing is benchmark testing to see what the rate of return in terms of processing and value in the metadata is, so that you get the right trade-off there. So some of you are thinking, I know you are, but don't we have some rich metadata now? I mean, do we really have to think about this? And the answer is, well, sort of. You see rich metadata, it's common with structured databases. So structured databases are like databases where you have some sort of content or record item, and somebody has input, usually manually, detailed information, essentially metadata about that record. And so you do see rich metadata in structured databases. The problem is the bulk of our enterprise content is not in structured data. It's free-flowing, it's email, it's Word docs, it's PowerPoints, it's all that goo, those business docs that we use every day that really don't have a lot of rich metadata. The other place we see sort of an A for effort, but kind of an F for implementation, is in these kind of forced wizards or forced pop-ups that force employees to enter metadata, or they can't save it, or they can't send it, or some such. Both Julie and I have strong feelings about the efficacy of these systems. Julie, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, they don't work. It's been proven out over my entire career, which we'll say is more than 20, because that means I'm at least 20. So what we get is a lot of times, particularly, I think the next slide has a picture of a profiling type of form. This is how we've tried to make armies of records managers. We've tried to make people fill out forms to tell us what the stuff is, both metadata that's available within the file natively, but also kind of the derived rich metadata that comes from the content or the context. But what happens is, particularly when there's drop-down lists involved in a form, we find that people either make no effort, and so we end up with a lot of Australian aardvarks because those are the A items available in the list, or we see inconsistent classification over time. Humans are notoriously bad at consistently classifying content, the same content. So, you know, how I classify a document today could be different than how I did it yesterday and different than how I'll do it tomorrow, just depending on, you know, maybe I have a really bad headache, or I don't know, something else is on my mind. And anyway, so we want to get away from the inconsistency of manual tagging and classification and metadata generation, because it's inconsistent, but also because we frankly shouldn't be asking people in the business to do that work. People in the business ought to be focusing on whatever it is that they're doing, making the widget, selling the widget, supporting the salespeople who sell the widgets, whatever it might be. They should be doing that, not worrying about how they help organizations manage the information that they're generating or receiving.
One of the things that Julie and I talked about earlier in planning for this session was this notion about an information black market, and that the more that an organization essentially pushes down onto the employees, enforcing systems like this or not letting them, save or do their function, the more there is essentially an effort to subvert the systems. And we're seeing this all over the place. Either employees are just bulk classifying everything as a record so they don't have to deal, which is, of course, totally wrong, or reprinting email elsewhere, or stashing documents in cloud-based systems like Box or Dropbox. All of these are essentially this information black market, and that's Julie's term, so credit where credit is due. And that the phrase that she used was that employees will take the path of less friction or least resistance when it comes to protecting their content. And so setting up manual classification systems are actually having a perverse incentive, a backlash of people subverting those very systems. So what we offer up instead is this notion of automated classification. Have the software do it either at the outset as that content is being born, or as it's being arrived, let's say in an acquisition or as a new system is coming online, or prior to a migration. What an excellent time to organize content and to classify it. So what we're seeing broadly is an evolution, a transformation from essentially what we would call a top-down approach, where the onus is on the employee, and it's sort of like the 10 Commandments being shoved down on them by policies and procedures. That is sort of the old way, being replaced by a content up approach, where the content itself is really driving the management, the life cycle, the access, any protections, and so on. So as we kind of evolve as a society, we're moving more and more to the bottom half of this screen. Julie, any examples of clients either on an enterprise-wide basis or a departmental basis that you can speak to going through this transformation?
We do see this happening. There's a lot of interest in vetting whether or not this will really work. And one of the reasons I think we're seeing this shift from the top down to the bottom up approach is volume. It's so volume driven, right? There's so much more content that has to be managed, and for so many more reasons today than there was 20 years ago when I started in this business, because it was paper, right? So we're talking about incomprehensible amounts of data. And so expecting any individual to actually actively tag and manage all of their own email for that matter, much less all the documents they create and whatnot, is quickly becoming an impossible task. So we know we have to use technology, but we're not sure yet, does it really work? And so we're seeing it start in pockets within an organization. Nobody's going at it at the enterprise scale to start. They're starting in places where, frankly, where you would normally start with records management, the areas in your organization that represent the most risk or reward for you, generally the most risk. So we're looking at functions within your business that are highly regulated or highly litigious. HR is one of those, certainly on the highly litigious side, and then highly regulated. So the manufacturing process for a pharmaceutical or something like that is where we're seeing these technologies being deployed and tried first to really prove out their ability to not just capture existing metadata that is in the file level, but to derive that rich metadata that becomes so important for us to make more complex and multifaceted decisions.
One thing that I would sort of advise everybody out there is there's a tendency to want to start department by department. Okay, let's do legal. Okay, let's do HR. My suggestion is that's fine, but if you can also get to the level of repository by repository, you're going to get some bang for the buck, because there are kind of connectivity issues, and that lets you migrate one repository at a time as opposed to department by department. there's different schools of thought on that, but we've seen the repository approach just move along a little more efficiently and faster, so that's our suggestion there.
Yeah, I do think, can I add on to that, Sandy? I think where that comes into play depends on who you're talking to or where you sit in the organization, right? So if IT is a driver of this kind of technology application to manage content, the repository approach is a lot easier to sell because they already think in that way. If your championship is through a business unit because they, failed an audit, and they're trying to not have that pain again, then you may have to start at the department, but you can consider a department as a proof of concept, and then say, okay, well, we proved it and we solved this department specific problem. Now let's shift and look at it from a repository perspective, because to your point, a department's data could be spread all over the organization in different networks, different applications, different cloud services. And so assembling that into looking at that as a whole may not be the most efficient way to get gains. So I'll just leave that there.
Yep. So at the end of the day, there are lots and lots of benefits that rich metadata gets you. We wanted to kind of take stock at this point because we're going to go from here into sort of a point of view. Right now, it's really been mostly sort of factual in nature with a little bit of point of view about the content up, but you're going to hear Sandy's soapbox in just a moment. So I wanted to kind of set that up, which is just as a, sort of a way of summary. The key takeaway of having rich metadata is that it lets you know what you have, where it is, and it lets you manage it intelligently over time. It explicitly goes across data repositories. This is really important because at this point of being, let's say, 20, 25 years digital, we have data repositories in every stage of life. Every organization has content in some sort of repository that's no longer being supported by the manufacturer, on up to the hottest new cloud thing that was born yesterday, and everything in between. Plus, content is being created and acquired constantly. And so the ability to see across data sources, again, this notion, this sort of separation of church and state, there's data where it lives, and then data how it's used. So the ability to see across is one of the big things that rich metadata gets you. It sets up data visualization and dashboards and reporting and things so that you can have a centralized view on your content, even if you don't have a single repository, which basically nobody does. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this ability to operate by facets. In other words, let the content itself drive the discussion, drive the decision-making, and drive the lifecycle management, as opposed to some simplistic approaches. The number one simplistic approach that we see is kind of arbitrary time-based. In other words, at 90 days, we're going to get rid of this content no matter what. And there are some pieces of content that everyone would panic. Do not get rid of this. It's essential. And for whatever reason, it hasn't been marked as a record or marked for permanent retention. Why? Because the tagging of that has been an employee-focused, one-by-one manual effort. And as mentioned earlier, nobody really has any incentive to do that. So now you have this kind of halfway world where things aren't really tagged correctly, and this kind of swooping angel of death is coming by every 90 days to wipe things out. The flip side of that is there are some content that should not live another second. And this is a good example. This is an actual example out of my email. We have 52 different spam filters here at Valora, and yet that target ad got through. I should not have to wait 90 days for this to be eliminated. It should eliminate on site. And then conversely, because I, like everybody else, I will admit it, I store things in my email as a virtual repository, including proposals and contracts. And if this were automatically wiped in 90 days, I would have been in real trouble. And so this kind of blind adherence to time-based management is really not something that we here at Valora advocate. I won't speak for you, Julie. I'll let you say your own version of that. But there really needs to be an approach that is value-based, that is rich metadata-based, content-aware, not just blind time-based.
Yeah, so before I share my thoughts on that, you're filling my nightmares again, because I don't know if you realized you said this, but you said there's a swooping angel of death coming to delete your stuff in 90 days. So thanks again for all the visuals today. Cracked me up. So yeah, look, time-based disposition or information management is a total cop-out. We do that because we believe that there is no other way to do it that is reasonable, right? So we don't have an army of people who can pop the lid off of every box and look at every document. We don't have people who have the time in their day to spend reading every email and tagging it and doing something with it. And that's just not true anymore. So when we started down this kind of this path of digitizing the way that we work, we quickly realized that we were out of control, and we didn't have tools like we have today to deal with them. And so we said, fine, we think that it's probably okay if we just get rid of this stuff after 90 days, because there was just no other way to do it. But the point is that there is now, and so we should break this really horrible habit that we started out of what seemed to be necessity. Because what it does is it also exacerbates the information black market that Sandy mentioned earlier. If somebody knows something's going to get deleted and they are afraid of that, let me tell you, people get really passionate about their stuff. They're going to stash it somewhere and to avoid it being disposed of. And we don't want that either, because it creates a whole nother set of classification and management problems for us to solve.
Not to mention legal exposure problems. Because remember from other sessions, if you have it, if it's been retained, whether black market approach or not, if you have it, it's discoverable, period. Okay, this is the slide that really I put in for all of you to take up to your bosses. You haven't accessed these items in a long time either, but it definitely doesn't mean you should just throw them out because time has passed. This metaphor works really well for different types of content. In fact, the content that is aging out, that's past that 3-year, 5-year time mark, is probably very important content. That's why it's been saved. So you really run the risk in time-based approaches of throwing out the wedding album because again, you haven't looked at it in a while, but there's a reason you kept it. And so that takes us into context. Earlier, Julie mentioned kind of the 3 levels of metadata: file level, things like last modified date; content level, things like document type; and now contextual. In other words, how does the meaning of this content or the use of this document or the tags that reference this document change given different circumstances? And so we're going to give you an example here about the exact same phrase being used in 4 different contexts that therefore give you very different meanings. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to get off mute. So look at the first one at the top left here, right? So we've got this cute little puppy. Hey, I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Oh, nobody's going to mind. How sweet. But then if we move to the right, we have a worker sitting at his desk saying, I wonder if anybody would mind if I just curled up under my desk and took a nap. Probably his manager would care, but maybe not the end of the world. Moving down to the bottom right, we have a homeless person that is saying, hey, I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Certainly tugs at our heartstrings, and again, maybe not life and death, but maybe we're heading in that way. And then the last one, the bottom left, I wonder if anyone would mind if I curl up under this desk and took a nap, and it's a pilot. So certainly the gravity of this content changes as we move through different contexts. And so thinking about, you know, personal information and, you know, where it is and how it's being used, and content from a context perspective adds a level of value to our ability to make decisions that will result in either good or bad outcomes. So I just love this slide. Thanks, Sandy, for letting us walk through it.
Sure thing. And one thing I will mention, one thing that contextual metadata gives you, this is something new that we've found in the last maybe 6 months, is it's an absolute gateway to security access to content. So understanding the context of, you know, where did this document come from, who should be looking at it, why is it in existence, how will it be used going forward, those are all contextual tags that might affect the storage of that file and the security access. Well, this contains personal data and we need to keep it because it's about a current employee, but we might need to lock down that. And if we're just migrating to a flatter file structure, we're going to need to make sure that we integrate with the federated security access controls on a content basis. That's a big change. Historically, security's been either at the file share or at the folder level, but what we enable with rich metadata now is to have security access controls at the content and even possibly the word by word level. It's a topic for another day, but I'll leave that with you guys as food for thought. And so what we're really describing now is rules. Historically, in these presentations, we talk about metadata, we talk about rules. Today was all metadata, and so rules is just going to get a lightweight treatment. But one of the things that rich metadata really sets up is the ability to run rules. And so you can see that here. Here's an example of what I would call kind of like a baby rule, a disposition retention type rule. And you can see the words in italics. Those are metadata tags, rich metadata tags, like document type. And so if you understand the type of document, maybe that's effective date or expiration date, some sort of germane date to a contract, then you can run a little rule and see whether this still needs to be kept as active, open access, etc. And then you're also setting up a life cycle management for when it no longer meets these criteria. And so once you understand that rich metadata really drives those rules, now you have everything at your fingertips. You can literally drive whatever it is you need to do around content now, later, way in the future, and in general, and as part of specific directed actions like migrations or data requests or litigation. Julie, anything you want to add about rules?
Just that they're my favorite thing, and we can't make use of them if we don't know what the heck our data is. So that really is the point of metadata, that you want metadata in order to enable taking action. And the rules are really, you know, the decision-making process, right? It takes the metadata that you have and applies it to a logic, and then it does something. And, you know, as a records manager, I like to throw things away. And so I can't do that if I don't know what it is, and I don't have confidence that what I think it is really what it actually is. So I'll leave there.
Okay. And I'm going to guess that most of the people that are attending a webinar on rich metadata are probably proponents of it. I wanted to let you know where you might find some allies within your organization and other groups, other organizations, departments that also have a use for rich metadata beyond the kind of pure play IG and RIM use cases. The first one, and we've mentioned this already today, is e-discovery. Because the goal in any discovery or litigation is to try and find the needles in the haystack, either that make your case or the areas of exposure. And so this is a common use case in e-discovery somewhat after the fact. What's starting to happen is a recognition that with this type of content analysis tools, you can be sort of always ready for litigation, what they call litigation readiness, and you can be applying that left of the EDRM approach to content at all times, so that the day that litigation comes, it's really just a matter of search and retrieval, as opposed to starting from scratch and going, okay, who knows what we got, let's start with collections. It really kind of automates a whole lot of that. Actually, before I go into data privacy, Julie, anything you want to add to e-discovery in terms of similar usage of rich metadata?
Yeah, no, I think you hit on it. The value proposition there is that it reduces the amount of stuff that some reviewer has to touch, and it reduces the risk of having to claw things back if they're released in error. So the less stuff you collect, the better. All around, and certainly the less risky. So, using that from the perspective of e-discovery readiness is a perfect use case.
Next up, we've talked about this as well, is data privacy. Usually these folks don't live within a records group. Often they're separate from IG as well. And particularly in Europe, this is a hot issue, but it's coming here to the US very quickly. If you're not familiar with CCPA, I strongly recommend you look into it and some of the other regulation that is coming down the pike. But basically, having rich metadata enables you to respond to data privacy requests in a realistic time frame and without a tremendous burden every time. Any large organization is likely to be facing several of these a month, so it's not an insignificant or one-time task. Another area, and this one's a bit newer, starting to hear this all over the place, and I don't know if that's because we're heading into the year 2020 and it sounds cool, but this notion of business transformation and really using automation and AI and machine learning and techniques like we've been describing here to reinvent the business. We're seeing a lot of this around the management and kind of reinvention of how we handle content, and so it's actually a handy ally to tie yourself in with the business transformation folks. IG has a lot more business transformation than I think people really realize. Julie, I'll let you explain that further.
Yeah, well, again, I hate to harp on the idea that we're finally realizing that we live in a pretty much digital world, but a lot of organizations are engaging in initiatives around business transformation, digitization, but they're doing it in a silo, and they're not leveraging the benefit of a lot of the good work that folks in RIM and IG roles have been working on to develop content classification approaches and technologies and using those for other purposes. It's almost just, all these are examples of think about the data from a different perspective, different use case. If I'm looking for a business transformation lens, I'm looking for indications of creating a new business model or changing a business model for an area of our business that's suffering compression. So all of that are indicators within content and context of content that could help me make smart decisions. So they just don't always know that it's possible. So it's upon us, those of us who are already in the choir, to share that all of this is possible and that we can support their initiatives in ways that maybe they weren't aware of.
And the last one, which I'll bring up, we don't usually talk about this on our kind of corporate IG-oriented discussions, but another whole area of folks that are using rich metadata on a daily basis, or what I would call data aggregators or clearinghouse or service bureaus. And these are either standalone organizations, or sometimes they're within a much larger organization, and sometimes as a kind of a captive in-house type of processing group. But basically what they're doing is they're purposely gathering data, usually on a daily basis, and data mining and analyzing that content to kind of repackage the findings and often sell it back to some other client or some other business unit. A good example of something like that would be, frankly, Zillow. If you've ever been on the website Zillow Real Estate, They are picking up the MLS listings from all the different states, mining the data, the name of the house, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, etc., and then packaging that up in their web application. So clearinghouse and data aggregators have a perpetual and very strong need for rich metadata, to the point where they are themselves profit centers oriented around the creation and packaging of rich metadata. So that is a really foreign concept for information governance professionals. One thing I would suggest to you is, if you are going to be mining data or creating metadata tags for one purpose, let's say migration or records or something, think about how you might package that data for someone else's benefit, because there probably is a proactive or some sort of use that would really benefit from understanding what that content was, and specifically maybe clauses or small data elements from within the content. Think things like, the client's shoe size or their favorite color. Like, how could that be used? And that takes us to some other, Julie, you mentioned earlier, some good examples of data aggregators making good use of rich metadata.
Yeah, I mean, just think about Facebook and Twitter, right? And we're helping Twitter because we're putting hashtags on everything. So we're doing a lot of classification for them, or contextualizing the tweets that we make and the posts that we post. But they're using all of that to sell to us in one way or another. So this is not a new concept, certainly as a business model, but it's growing in both the popularity and the potential risk associated with it.
So that takes us into some of the real-world case studies. I have 3 of them for you today, and I will talk to them. I invite your questions, and Julie, certainly your color commentary anytime. So the first real-world case study of rich metadata is a large oil and gas company, multinational, and they're so big and they've grown by acquisition like many companies have. The contracts that they are responsible for, that the legal team is responsible for, belong to the individual business units. And so there's no central organization, there's no central repository, content is in dozens of locations, and yet legal is supposed to be protecting the organization as a whole, to be monitoring it and protecting against exposure as a whole. So what they are looking to do is kind of put together what they would call a virtual vault. In other words, a kind of simulated single share, even though no content is actually moving, just the metadata information is kind of coming together from across the repositories to make a unified sort of reporting front-end data dashboard without actually taking physical control of the content. So a very novel use, very smart, intelligent use of rich metadata. The next one is a little smaller, a regional retailer that is consolidating their HR records across all of their stores. They have several dozen stores. And so different materials, again, being stored in different platforms, different locations, and what they need is kind of a centralized view when they don't actually have their hands on all of the content. Eventually they'll move that up to the cloud, but even then it's likely to be decentralized. And so this is a way for them to understand everything that's related to a single employee, even when employees transfer from store to store to store. So very interesting use case there as well. And then the last one is an example of that data aggregator clearinghouse type of use case where the organization is analyzing bankruptcy forms, which get filed, sadly, all the time, and pulling out all the data that's a matter of public record. So all the data, who's filing for bankruptcy, what was their collateral, what were the terms of the loan, blah, 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 152 fields related to those forms on a daily basis across every jurisdiction in the United States. Pretty tall effort. You could do that by hand, but you would need thousands of staff. Instead, they're using automated rich metadata capture to do this on a 24/7 basis. So it looks like a question has come up. Let's see. Oh, okay, no, it was just a question to me. Okay. So those are 3 good use cases, very different use cases of kind of rich metadata in action. Julie, any comments?
No, I think those are great examples. Keep moving.
Okay, so that basically takes us into kind of the final segment here, which is once you kind of get your arms around rich metadata, what it is, why it's so beneficial, all the things that it enables, you realize that we're having a conversation about information governance. And sometimes I start with this, but today the focus was supposed to be about metadata, and so we're going to end here because metadata really does drive information governance in a way that was previously just not possible. We were basically taking broad brushstrokes, best guesses, time-based approaches. These were all limited abilities with what was possible. With auto-classification rich metadata, now you really can have true information governance. If you're not familiar with this concept, here are 2 definitions that I particularly like. I'm going to guess most of the people on this call know these things, but we're going to give you a copy of these slides, and this is what you can slide under the nose of whoever it is you need to convince in your organization. And really what we've been talking about on this entire webinar series this year are the 8 pillars of information governance. One of them really is the magic key to all the others, and that's classification, because it's very tough to do retention or ROT or data privacy if you don't know what you actually have. And so classification is kind of the linchpin. If you're only going to do one thing, I recommend you do that. If you're wondering where to start, start there. Julie, anything to add?
Yeah. I can just say, in working with clients and data over the years, it is eye-opening when you really can understand your data in a detailed way and derive new insights from the content and the context, not just what the file says it is. It really does enable decision making that feels good, right? So, for example, I had a client a few years ago who had 40 terabytes of file share data, and they didn't know what to do with it. They wanted to go to a time-based retention on it because they didn't feel like they could look at everything and make eyes wide open decisions about it. And I said, well, you know what? Let's use some technology in this context and see what we can find out about it. And so, just a simple ROT review where we were looking for basically exact duplication, because there's usually a lot of that floating around in large file share environments like that. We found about 30% of that 40 terabytes was actually exact duplicate. So we couldn't have made a case, really a compelling case to the organization to say, you know, we want to invest in this technology, we want to take the time and effort to do this project, and we're going to get rid of a bunch of data with confidence that it's not going to stop you from being able to do your business. We couldn't have been compelling if we couldn't have showed the real facts behind that. And so that's really, it enables all of these things. If you want to set retention periods so you're sure you're keeping things the right amount of time, you want to control privacy or access rights for other reasons, you need to apply legal holds, or get things for e-discovery in a short period of time, or respond to a DSAR. Metadata and classification is your key. If you can't do that well, you won't do any of these other things well.
So that's the perfect lead into our last slide, which is really understanding whether you call it content classification or rich metadata. It's all the same thing. It's tags that indicate what the files are and how they should be handled. And the real trick is to get away from a manual approach, to get away from kind of simplistic approaches, manual, time-based, inherit from the rest of the folder, to really focus on each piece of content and have it stand on its own. It is really the first step in any kind of content lifecycle management system, and therefore any information governance policies and enactment. And so it is the tool, it is the key to providing enterprise command and control. of enterprise information. So that's why we strongly advocate for rich metadata. Hopefully at this point you are now a rich metadata expert, and you will join us next time where we delve into data privacy and security. I will have Antigone Payton as my special guest. She is excellent and you will love her just like we love Julie. And so we hope to see you all on November 20th. This presentation will be made available to all of you. Thank you for registering and attending.
Your info here, and we'll make sure in the communication that goes out that my information is available as well. So if you think of something that you wanted to ask us, just shoot us a note. We're always happy to connect and you know, swap war stories and whatnot. So yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay. If any of you want to take our poll on the way out, we would appreciate that. Hopefully you can see that now. Tell us what it is that's your most pressing data need now that you've heard an hour on metadata. A couple more still coming in. Okay, I will share responses with you guys. Here you go. About what we might expect. So thanks again, everybody, for your attendance. We look forward to hearing from you with your feedback or your questions, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you too, Julie.
See you soon. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.